Given how unassuming George Grant was, given his status on the periphery of Canadian intellectual life, it's probably fitting that his gravestone is attended by no great fanfare. But George Grant is easily one of the most significant Canadian thinkers of all time. He's one of the most significant analysts of the modern West. And George Grant has perhaps never been more relevant than he is right now. His most famous book, Lament for a Nation, looked at Canada vis-a-vis the United States of America. It looked at questions of Canadian nationalism and Canadian sovereignty. And it did so in a searingly insightful and indeed prophetic way, which assessed the trajectory of the Western modern project and what it did to countries like Canada. And so at this time we have a tremendous resource in George Grant for our thinking about what to do and how to imagine Canada as we move towards this forthcoming election. Reading Lament for a Nation at this time is quite an arresting experience. It's one of those books that are written quite quickly and in response to a very particular situation. The urgency and the emotion of the author is very clear. You might think of Lenin's What Is to Be Done. This book, which is filled with these short, urgent sentences. So too Lament for a Nation, which spends the first few chapters discussing Diefenbaker's removal as Prime Minister. It's a removal which is lost on me in many of the details. I'm not Canadian and I wasn't around at that time and have no great understanding of Canadian history. But the way Grant tells it, there is a consensus among what really could be described as the elites. The media, certain establishment figures within business and indeed within politics, to move beyond the kind of nationalistic understanding that Diefenbaker was offering. The issue at hand was the establishment of American nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, and the issue in Grant's understanding was the issue of Canadian sovereignty. What is Canada to be? From Grant's perspective, modernity, this set of forces unleashed in the Enlightenment, perhaps even in the Renaissance, set in motion a set of trajectories which ultimately led to the erasure of national, local, communitarian identities in favor of creating a shell for capitalism. Communism and capitalism compete, in a sense, to be the social and political expression of the modern impulse in Grant's telling. And communism, Marx, for example, saw himself as being overwhelmingly progressive. He thought, Marx did, that communism was going to be the political, social and cultural ideology of the modern West. But for Grant, Marx misunderstands something. Marx believes that human pathologies, greed and so on and so forth, are a product of unjust situations. For example, the alienation caused by capitalism. And if we remove those situations, then we will no longer be greedy, and so we won't need to corral or to curtail human desire. And for Grant, Marx simply misunderstands that. For Grant, human greed is something which is ground into the bedrock of what it means to be human. Grant is a very traditional Christian. He's an Anglican, and he's infused with Augustinian sensibilities. And so Marx misunderstands that. In contrast, capitalism understands and expresses the fundamental desire of modern people to be free from any curtailment on their desire. That we want to be whatever will give us pleasure. We want to attain whatever will give us pleasure. We want money, we want commodities, we want food, we want all these things. And capitalism and mass production will provide all these things without any checks and balances on our desire. And so capitalism is the social, political and economic ideology of modernity in a way that communism can't be. And capitalism has its mothership, for George Grant, in the United States of America, that the Western project has as its queen, its mother, its sovereign, the USA. Canada represented, for Grant, something different. It represented a conversation between three forces. One of those forces is Indigenous Canadian identity and Indigenous Canadian perspectives. He doesn't address this too much in Lament for a Nation, but he touches on it elsewhere. Another perspective is Grant's own perspective, that of the Anglo-Canadian, particularly the high Anglican Canadian identity, which always has a peep over to see what's happening at Oxbridge, and represents a conservatism which, for Grant, is never capitalist. It's never focused on business or free markets or any of those things. It's a conservatism in so much that it values virtue and it values creating the conditions for humans to flourish, and therefore a society will need certain checks and balances on human greed, human self-assertion, and so on and so forth. And so it's not simply progressive in the sense of an embrace of unbridled exploration, unbridled curiosity, unbridled mass production, unbridled research, unbridled technology, because it will say, well, what among these things are good for people and what among these things are bad for people? That's the conservatism that Grant sees as being inherent in the Anglo-Canadian experience. And then there is the Quebecois Catholic experience. And he cites some Quebecois thinkers who say that this Christian identity that is central to Francophone Canadian identity needs to be protected even from France itself. It's an assertion of a commitment to a set of values that can't be eroded by progress or capitalism or brute aggression masquerading as virtue. This is a form of Catholic identity that Grant quite, I think, very insightfully understands as being capable of being washed away by the form of liberal Catholicism that he sees in people like John Courtney Murray in the United States of America. We're thinking about, about the conversation in the 60s here. And so there are these three very anti-modern identities. The Indigenous perspective is entirely anti-modern in the sense that it's anti-modernist, it's anti-Western, it's anti-Enlightenment. So too, although in a different way, is the French Catholic experience, and the Anglo-Canadian experience is more measured, but it is certainly a riposte, although not a complete rejection of some of the forces in modernity. And over and against this, you have the West, you have Westerndom, you have this empire that is simply committed exclusively to the notion of progress, to the notion of unbridling human desire and human greed in all its spaces, in capitalism, in sexual excess. He talks about Playboy and things of this nature. Consumption, all these things that will reduce the working classes, from Grant's perspective, to the status of a trough animal, dining in pleasure and commodities, and that's perfectly fine for the ruling elites, as long as 1% of them become the engineers and the scientists that the social order needs to progress. And so the modern West, with the United States as its spearhead, emerges as the annihilation of ethnic and national identities, the annihilation of all cultures other than itself, and itself isn't a culture so much as the evacuation of culture in order to let capitalism be. And this development within Canadian culture, where it doffed the cap and bent the knee to America, allowing American nuclear weapons into Canada, was simply the surrendering of any hope that Canada could be an alternative outpost within this North American experiment. And Grant, his wife Sheila, in the postscript to a copy of the book that I have, she says, it's not in any way pessimistic. And that's... She'd know better than me, but it is definitely a lament. It is a lament because Grant does not see these forces as coherently stoppable outside of a kind of a Tolkien-esque theological vertical inbreaking of grace from above, in Lord of the Rings, when there is no rational reason why they wouldn't be about to receive their comeuppance, and all of a sudden something happens, something breaks in, some deus ex machina breaks in from above and saves them and carries them off. This is the only kind of hope that I think Grant sees, by virtue of the fact that these forces, where capitalism saddles human greed and human demand for pleasure and human demand for consumption, and that the universities and the media subconsciously buy into this by defending the myth of progress, by affirming the necessity of more freedom, by demonizing anything that would curtail this as somehow backward or ignorant, and all these forces which themselves, so an example of this might be that there is an ideology which would enable you to get academic advancement, or which would enable you to get grants and scholarships, and so your work will naturally kind of just gravitate to incorporate these elements, and will eschew elements that don't incorporate these elements, and thereby the logic of capital determines the culture. And we see this in the media. We see this as our media evolves to be a vehicle for the selling of advertising, and media serve to just attract eyes through tribalism, usually, in order for advertising to be sold on our web pages. These forces are brutal. These forces are barbaric. What these forces lead to is a situation in which Canada refuses its sovereignty, refuses a cultural identity as anything other than a shell for capitalism, which is perfectly fine for those benefiting from it, media, academics, politicians, and so on and so forth, while all the while people are literally dying in tents, having no houses in Halifax. In December, I was struck by the fact that I was struck by, for selfish reasons, because I'm 51, and 3 men of a similar age to me died in tents in the run-up to Christmas here in Halifax. These people in tents, I know a couple of them, their access to healthcare is very, very, very limited. It's conducted through dialogue with Maple Care on phones. One person I spoke to is a diabetic, and it's 4 years since his last blood sugar reading. He's just been cut loose, and all these people are cut loose by our social order, which has simply failed them. I saw a video again shortly after Christmas of someone from inside a tent in a storm, and the tent was just being buffeted on all sides, and it was lifting off the ground, and this is simply unacceptable. And this is our social order. Last night, actually the night before last, this is Saturday, it was Thursday night, I was leaving Shoppers, and there was a poor lady, and she was shooting up outside the Dollarama. This is our social order. It seems to be every weekend there's a stabbing or a shooting a mile or so away from our house in North Dartmouth. Our society is brutalising and abandoning the working class, and we largely don't care, because most of these folks in tents tend not to vote that much, and they certainly haven't got much of a voice in online spaces, and so we simply pursue our progressive agendas while inflating and inflaming our own status within the social order at their expense. This is in Canada. This is in George Grant's Canada. Now, the alternative certainly isn't Donald Trump's America. But George Grant would say, by all means, elbows up. By all means, attack this globalist capitalist project that is annihilating Canadian values and Canadian virtues. By all means do that, but do so in a way that's attentive to the genuine Canadian difference, as opposed to a bullshit Canadian difference. And what I mean by a bullshit Canadian difference, the idea that we're exactly the same as any other global capitalist economy, but we care more, because that's just bullshit. You can't have people dying like flies in tents, people shooting up outside Shoppers, people without a healthcare system in Halifax, while retaining the idea that, that just because, you smile at someone in your farmer's market on a Saturday, some other bourgeois person buying, extremely fancy food, that somehow this is a more ethically positive space. Canada, at this election, needs to have a second element from the George Grant perspective. Yes, elbows up to America in order to be what? In order to be what? And if that what is just the globalist space for capitalism to run free, and all the virtueless virtues of capitalism, pure liberation from anything, then no good will come of it. What's this video about? This video is simply to suggest that you take some time on the run-in to this April election to have a read of George Grant's Lament for a Nation. As a non-Canadian, I'm an immigrant here. My capacity to be in Canada is entirely indexed to my job. If my job goes, I can't be here. I'm not a citizen. And so I'm an outsider, and I really don't know what I'm talking about. I'm simply someone who has been reading George Grant for a while, never read Lament for a Nation, started into it, so it was all about Canadian politics in the 60s and said, that's not for me. Took the time to read it completely last month and was just shocked by how contemporary it is, shocked by the ridiculous accuracy of his prophecy. That in the 60s he knows that communism is toast. And he knows that communism is toast not because of any economic reasons, but simply because it doesn't express the ideology of modernity to the extent that capitalism does. He knows it's gone. He also knows what happens to the planets who orbit around the sun that is the United States of America. He knows that they are erased in terms of their cultural and national identity and become this Western-dom blob in the same way that at the time maybe Hungary or Poland or Romania were being absorbed into the Soviet space. A conversation surely needs to be had about what is Canada, and the conversation has to be about more than we're that, but slightly nicer. We're that, but with smiles at the farmer's market. Canada has got to be about something else. Grant had a vision, maybe that vision is long lost, but it was an identity. What can Canada be if it's to be something other than the shell for global capitalism? What can Canada be if it is to be a place where people don't die in tents in Halifax? What is Canada to be if Canada is to be a place where those living in tents can get access to healthcare? Anyway, this is a Jeremiah in support of George Grant's Lament for a Nation, which I think we should all be reading right now, from Grant's gravestone. Even though he's Anglican, I hope he doesn't mind me as a Roman Catholic saying a little prayer for him and a little prayer of gratitude for his prophetic and beautiful witness, which is inspirational. And yeah, it's a nice spot down here too. I don't know if my camera will let you see, but it's like, this is such a beautiful part of the world. Like, this is beautiful, beautiful, beautiful land. Turtle Island at its most beautiful. We shouldn't have people dying in tents here. Take care.